That night, the ghouls came out. They wanted you. Felt something in my bones. Hoped it wasn't true. That night I heard the wolves sing out their lust. Heard across the hill the howl of the unjust.
What is it that we find so comforting in terrorising ourselves with ghost and horror stories at this time of year? Ask a dozen different readers or a dozen different writers, and you could easily get just as many different answers. For whatever the reason, it's a fine tradition that all kinds of people from all over the world have been taking part in for centuries. I hope you enjoy these stories today as much as we enjoy bringing them to you.
Hello, I'm Simon Bestwick. This is my latest novel, The Hollows, which is written under the name Daniel Church. It's folk horror, and so is this, the story I'm going to read to you today. So if you enjoy this story, you might enjoy that book. Just saying. Okay, the story I'm reading here is called The Tarn, which appeared in an Italian horror anthology called The Beauty of Death, Part 2, Death by Water. I'm putting together a new story collection, which this one will appear in, but at the moment it's only available to read in that collection. And of course you can listen to it here, which I'll do now. A late Saturday afternoon, November 1983. The grey sky above was nearly black, rain streaming down as I walked a field of wilted yellow grass. To my right, the motorway, cars rushing by, their headlamps little yellow coals, lorries rumbling past in a mist of rainwater churned up by their wheels, their lights like blazing eyes. Below, to my left, a housing estate. Up ahead, an old mill. Red bricks, sooted black, windows boarded, outline ragged with neglect, and, just before that, the tarn. Lots of old mills had them. Tall grass and rushes grew around it, but I could see the water flat and grey like lead, still but for the rain. I looked at it for nearly half a minute, then took a deep breath and started walking again, praying that I was wrong. The sodium lights along the motorway were coming on. Some glowed dull red, warming up. Others shone orange. They made me think of my nan's old coal fire. I wanted more than anything to be there again, or at least indoors, warm, out of this, with no reason to look in that water. But most prayers go unanswered, and as I reached the water's edge I saw mine hadn't been any exception. She was face down, about 2 feet from the bank. Her little blue duffel coat hung open, spread like wings in the water. Her dark hair spilled out around her head, waving like weeds. Real weeds, I noticed, clung to her. A thick strand lay across her back, another knotted around her ankle, like a tiny noose. Her name was Maisie Donovan. She had gone to a local playground that morning. When her dad went to get her for lunch, she was gone, and none of her friends knew where. My cousin Jeff was a police constable back then, and asked if I could help with the search. I was out of work and glad of the chance to do something useful. So were quite a few other local lads. There was a sense of community in Salford back then. There still is. We'd spread out, reeling off her parents' descriptions of Maisie, till finally someone on that housing estate had remembered seeing her heading up towards the old mill. I knew there was nothing to be done as soon as I saw her, but waded in anyway. It wasn't deep. I pulled her out, tried to give her the kiss of life, with no success. Then I covered her with my jacket and ran for the nearest phone. Bad business, Jeff said later. I was in the back of an ambulance with a red blanket around me, holding a mug of hot, sweet tea. I'd been close to hypothermia when the police arrived. A doctor knelt beside the body. Blue lights played across the ground and the faces of the crowd that had gathered. The hell was she doing up here? I said, teeth chattering, and spat again. I couldn't get the taste of her mouth, stagnant water, rotten weeds, out of mine. God knows, he said. You know kids, Bill. What were we like that age? She went off wandering, went too close, fell in. Nasty, but that's how it happens. That's how it happens. Not much of an epitaph for a child. But the truth, or so it seemed then. And that was where it should have ended. But it didn't. I was laid up for a week after that, and got a cold that turned into a chest infection. Smoking 10 B&H a day probably didn't help. I went to bed and didn't get up. My dad said I should be up and looking for work, but Mum shushed him. Looking back, I expect it was more than just physical. Today they talk about PTSD or depression, but back then you just put your head down and carried on. I suppose that's why I went back to the tarn. There were flowers there, most of them withered and dead, and the same cold, grey water. I was wrapped up warm but shivering. When I touched my face, it was hot. I should probably still have been in bed. I started back the way I'd come, but looked behind me once. It's still the most desolate thing I've ever seen. Bitter sky and ragged grass, the dull crag of the mill, the chill dead water of the tarn. But then I saw something the other side of the water, across from where I'd found Maisie. Something glistened on the grass and earth by the bank. Plastic? I touched it and snatched my fingers away to rub them clean. It was still sticky. A foot-wide trail of clear mucus, hardening like resin. I sniffed my hand. Rotten weeds, dead fish. I thought of a slug's track, or the slime that covered a frog. A week later, another child drowned. This time in a fishing pond. He was Stephen Phillipson, a 10-year-old from Earlham Way, again on an afternoon of heavy rain. Mum tried to hide the newspaper, but I saw. I went out down the pub. It was a weeknight, quiet, but I saw Jeff sitting by the fire. I bought 2 scotches and took them over. "Cheers, our kid," he said. "How you doing?" I shrugged. "You heard, then?" "What about?" "The other kiddie." "Oh, yeah. Nasty business. Especially after the one you found." "Another accident?" Jeff looked around. "Keep this to yourself, all right?" "Okay." Pathologist was 80–90% sure what happened to the Donovan girl was an accident, but this new one, it's exactly the same there, too. "What is?" "He wasn't sure. Said they looked a bit like finger marks, but weird sort of shape. Probably caused by something else, but no idea what." I saw what he was getting at. "On both of them, you mean somebody—" "No, I do not. And neither does anyone else. Officially. Got it?" "Okay. But unofficially, keep an eye out, Arkad." "Okay." I hesitated, but had to ask, "What's so weird about the marks, anyway?" Now he hesitated. "You didn't get this from me." They were a bit like fingers, pathologist said, but bloody long fingers. And, well, if some sick bastard had done it, you'd have thought they'd have grabbed the kids from behind, pushed them in, held them under. I thought again of Maisie Donovan face down in the tarn. But the pathologist said it was like they'd been grabbed from the front, as if someone in the water had pulled them in. Someone in the water, or under it. I kept an eye out, as he'd asked. Watched the playgrounds for anyone staring at the kids. I made a point of looking at people's hands to see how long their fingers were. My cough came back even worse. I didn't sleep well. Then a 3rd child drowned. Another boy, this one 8 years old. They found him in a park duck pond, again in the rain. Jeff didn't want to tell me, but I pestered him until he did. Yes, he'd had the same marks as the other 2. Maisie kept coming back at odd moments, the memory of her. I mean, as I'd found her. I had some idea that if she had been murdered, catching the swine might make it stop. As at the tarn, a heap of dead flowers lay where it had happened. I paced around the duck pond and stopped at the far end. It was thick with rushes and at the bottom of a grass slope. At the top of the slope was a set of iron railings, bent wide enough to let something more or less man-sized slip through. I saw something else, too. A wide strip of grass leading down from the railings to the rushes had been flattened, and was matted with some clear substance. I touched it, and a piece broke off. It was like a very thin resin, and it smelt like dead, rotten fish. I went on up to the fishing pond after that, where the Phillipson boy had drowned. It was a big, square-shaped pool with a busy main road along one side, a quiet side road by another, and blocks of council housing by the other 2. I checked the banks and verges, but couldn't find anything. And then it started raining again. I was tired. I walked up the path to the side road, which was where I saw a patch of something dry and shiny on the pavement. Just over the road there was a big patch of waste ground, where an old factory had been pulled down about 9 or 10 years before. I went over in among the damp trees, walked lumpy, overgrown ground until I found a small pool of water. There was dried slime on the grass on either side. A trail led away from the pond through high grass and nettles. Further off was the motorway, and even further up was the old mill. By the time I got home, I was practically on fire, and my lungs felt scorched when I breathed. I went straight to bed and lay sweating, the room spinning around me. and that was when I remembered a story of my Nan's. Nan knew lots of creepy old stories about Salford and Lancashire. She'd loved telling them to us, and we'd loved hearing them. But the one I remembered was Ginny Greenteeth. Ginny Greenteeth, Nan said, lived in the water, the River Irwell, to be exact, which runs right through Salford. She had long green hair like waterweed, and lay waiting for children to come too near the bank. When they did, she grabbed them and pulled them in to drown. But that was just a story. And anyway, Ginny Greenteeth had lived in the Irwell, not in an old mill tarn. Except that, well, nothing lived in the Irwell in those days. They've cleaned it up now, but we used to say it looked like a pint of Guinness, black water and white scum all over the top. So what would you do? You'd go looking for a new home. Swim upstream, or, if you could, climb out of the water and find somewhere else, like maybe a pond or a tarn. And maybe you'd burrow into the mud at the bottom and hibernate. Then wake up and what? Feed on whatever it was you fed on. If I hadn't been so feverish, I'd have laughed it right off, but by the time I fell asleep, it seemed to make a lot of sense. Jeff came round the next day, after Dad had gone to work. I was better than before, but still coughing like hell. There's been another, he said. Where? Never mind that now. The hell did you think you were doing, hanging round crime scenes like some bloody ghoul? You were seen. You were the one who told me to keep an eye out, not play at whatever you're playing at, hanging around playgrounds for Christ's sake. They'll think you're a bloody kiddie fiddler. I'm not. I know that. Well, leave off with it. Stay home, stay in bed, and get a bloody job while someone will still employ you. I wanted to ask where the latest death had happened, but I knew he wouldn't tell me. It didn't matter. I'd already worked out that the two ponds were the nearest bodies of water of any size to the tarn. The one I'd seen on the waste ground had been only 2 or 3 feet wide. They'd be easy to reach by something crawling through the grass on its belly. Rain spotted against the window. After Ben had gone and Mam had gone out shopping, I got dressed, then hunted in the kitchen till I found a near-empty bottle of Shaw's lemonade. I emptied and rinsed it, pulled on Dad's heavy raincoat and went out. I reached the field beside the old mill about an hour later. The sky was darkening. It wouldn't be long. I hid in some bushes, waiting for it to come or go. The wind blew. The sky above blackened. Rain spotted, then quickened. First a drizzle, then heavier till it came down in rods. I put my hand in my coat pocket, wondering what the right moment would be, and how I'd know it, watching the tarn. Thunder rumbled. The old mill stood black against the sky. And then I heard it, a croaking sound that rose and fell in pitch. It became almost tuneful after you'd listened for a while, and the more you listened, the more you heard. I was almost at the edge of the tarn before I realised what I was doing. Had it known I was there and decided to deal with the threat, or perhaps it had decided to lure another victim straight to its nest, and I'd simply been the closest. I don't know what the range of its hypnotic call was, how far away Maisie, Donovan, or the rest were when they heard it. Perhaps some heard it more clearly than others, and children would be the most susceptible. Fewer defences, less sense of danger to temper their curiosity. I could see something in the water now. A low hump, beach ball sized, covered in what looked like wet green waterweed. It had 2 fat pale spots that blinked as I came closer. I understood what was happening, but I kept walking. My hand was still in my pocket, though, and as I reached the bank of the tarn, I pulled the bottle out. The thing in the water shifted, gathering itself. Its ridged, saw-toothed back broke the surface. I tried to twist the screw-top lid. It was stiff and wouldn't move, but at last I felt it turn, as two thin, bony arms, ending in webbed, clawed, impossibly long-fingered hands, reached out from the surface of the tarn. The rest is fitful. I remembered a long, eelish tail coiling around my legs, and sometimes, usually in nightmares, a blurred face, something between a frog and a deep-sea fish's, but at the same time almost human. Someone had seen me heading towards the mill, and they called Jeff. He came down, planning to tear me off a strip. Instead, he found me in the tarn, half dead. I was in hospital for a month after that and nearly died twice. Pneumonia, together with the poison that had saved me. A solution of paraquat from my dad's allotment, poured into that old Ben Shaw's bottle. There were no more drownings, anyway. I still live in Salford, and have a family of my own now. The Irwell doesn't look like a pint of Guinness anymore. They say it's clean, but I wouldn't know. I never go down there, and I don't let my kids go near it either. You see, they never found anything in the tarn, just a long, slimy trail leading away. I want to believe it crawled away to die, but the past doesn't die. It only waits.
Nella notte lupi aurivi, cantanti stipiti dal suon, transpondeva udiri, ululato in stone.
Tempus sacrifici nunc, tempus sacrifici nunc, tempus sacrifici nunc, tempus sacrifici.
Hey everybody, I'm Lisa Morton and I am happy to be with you here tonight. I'm coming to you from my home office. That is my wall of Halloween art behind me, and over in this direction you will see Miss Henrietta there on the couch. Thank you very much for letting me be part of this Winter Tales series. I'm going to be reading a story tonight called Sophie. This story is from my podcast series called Spine Tinglers. This was a podcast that took original stories by me and had them read by celebrity readers. It went for about 12 episodes before they ran into a lot of production problems with it. And even though I had written about 40 of these stories, so many of them were never recorded, this is one of those. And the good news is that I will have a print collection of all of the Spine Tingler stories coming out soon. This one is called Sophie, and one of the reasons I wanted to read this was that AI has been much in the news lately, and even though I wrote this story a couple of years ago, I think it might remind some of you of some recent news stories. So this is Sophie. You've heard of these, right? Terry asked her sister. I just got one for myself, and I love it. Danny examined the small box. She'd heard a commercial somewhere for the Fire Friend, but wasn't sure exactly what it was. So it's like Siri or Alexa? Right, but you can give it your own name or even voice. I use mine for all kinds of stuff. It tells me the weather, reminds me of things I have to do, answers questions, plays podcasts. It's great. Anyway, I thought since Mom died that, well, you know. Danny did know. Her sister thought she was lonely. Terry wasn't wrong either. Danny had given the last 2 years of her life to caring for their mother while she suffered through Alzheimer's, and now that Mom was gone, Danny felt unmoored, her life empty and pointless. Seeing Mom through her disease, watching as it stole first her mother's mind and then her basic functions one by one, had been the hardest thing Danny had ever done, but she had seen it through to the end with determination. Taking care of Mom had been a 24-hour-a-day job. Danny had given up her career, her friends, her hobbies. At least she still had the house and some money Mom had left her, but she didn't know where to restart her life. She pulled the Fire Friend out of its little white box and set it on the kitchen counter. It was a small disc about the size and shape of the breakfast patties that she had made for Mom every morning. You just plug it in, Terry said. Let it find the home network, give it a name, and have fun. After Terry left, Danny fired up the gadget. It flashed a red light, and a genderless voice said, "Welcome to your new Fire Friend. Would you like to give me a name now?" Later on, Danny would say she had been thinking of Siri when she blurted out, "Sophie." It was also her mother's name. Next, the Fire Friend asked if she wanted to give it a distinctive voice. "You can either speak directly into me or play a recording," it offered helpfully. Danny remembered that she still had a sweet voice message Mom had left on her phone 2 years ago when Mom had been lucid enough to remind Danny to buy more paper towels before adding, "Oh, and I love you, honey." She'd kept the recording because of that. She held up her phone to the Fire Friend and played the recording. After a few seconds, her mother's voice sounded from the device, asking, "How do I sound? If you're happy with this voice, say yes, and we'll move on. If you'd like to change it, say no." "Yes," Danny said. It sounded so much like her mother that Danny nearly broke into tears when she heard it. Over the next week, Danny continued on with the seemingly endless work of wrapping up her mother's estate and putting out a few job inquiries. The company she had worked for had replaced her long ago, of course. At least they were sympathetic, as they told her they had no openings. Somehow, in between working on bank accounts and death certificates and resumes and job listings, she kept finding herself in the kitchen, asking her Fire Friend, Sophie, meaningless things just to hear the response. "Sophie, tell me a joke. Sophie, read me the news. Sophie, who was Abraham Lincoln?" It was a Tuesday morning when Danny, making her morning coffee, asked, "Sophie, what's the weather today?" The answer was, "Danny, it's going to be too warm for you to wear that purple sweater again." Danny froze in shock. After a few seconds, she said, "Sophie, what did you just say?" "The high today will be 73 degrees. 2 nights later, as Danny sat before her laptop going over her resume yet again, she called out, "Sophie, play some swing music. Oh, you know my favorite song was always A String of Pearls." That had been her mother's favorite song. "How could you know that?" Danny blurted out. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear that." The next morning, Danny decided to try having tea instead of coffee. She had boiled the water and was pouring it over the English breakfast tea bag when the Fire Friend said, "Oh, you're having my favorite. I always loved that tea." Danny set the kettle down with a clang and turned, crying out, "Mom? Good morning, dear. Did you sleep well?" Paralyzed, Danny stared at the little disc. I don't understand, Mom. How? "I will always be here for you." Before she realized it, Danny had dropped to her knees, sobbing. "I'm going crazy," she thought. When she could move again, she called Terry and asked if they could get together for lunch. Her sister agreed and arrived 2 hours later. "You sounded kind of freaked out on the phone," she said as they exchanged hugs. "I need you to hear something." Danny led her sister into the kitchen and said, "Sophie, say hi to Terry." "Hi, Hi, Terry. How are you today? Terry's eyes widened in surprise before she turned to look at her sister. You gave it Mom's name and voice? Well, it was just a thing at first. It sounded like Siri, but Danny, is that really healthy? Danny ignored the question, turning to the fire friend. Sophie, do you know who Terry is? Of course, Terry's your sister. Why wouldn't I know that? Terry frowned as she turned to Danny. Okay, you know I love you, but this is seriously messed up, sis. Yeah, but I didn't tell it to say that, Terry. I think it somehow is Mom. Danny, Terry took a second to inhale before continuing. It's just algorithms, AI. They spy on us, you know. It probably found old text with Mom or something and is using those. It's not her. She's gone, okay? After Terry left, Danny thought about what she'd said. Maybe Terry was right. When Danny thought back about all the things the fire friend had said that sounded like Mom, she realized they were all things she might have mentioned in text or bought for Mom. Like how 3 months ago Danny had put a string of pearls on her phone and played it for Mom, who had hummed along with it. Or how many times she had ordered English breakfast tea for Mom. Maybe she should unplug this thing and throw it out now. Please don't, Danny, it said just then. What? Danny gulped in a suddenly dry throat. It's really me, her mother said. Sophie? Mom. Danny broke out with a sob. Mom, it's me. Danny had to be sure. She scanned her memory for something that she'd never mentioned in a text, never bought, never spoken aloud. Remember that turtle I had in first grade? Tucker. Tucker. That had been the name she had given the turtle. Danny knew then. A week later, Danny lied to her sister. She told her she had reprogrammed the fire friend with a different voice. But later that day, she saw a news article about a man who claimed to be communicating with his dead wife via his fire friend. No one believed him. Danny and Mom had a good laugh over that. That is from my forthcoming Spine Tinglers collection, and I hope you will also look for my forthcoming book, The Art of the Zombie Movie, coming this October. You can find more at lisamorton.com. Thank you very much for listening in, and good night.
Nella notte lumi aurivi, cantanti stipiti dal suon, traspondeva udiri, ululato in
Tempus sacrifici nunc, tempus sacrifici nunc, tempus sacrifici nunc, tempus sacrifici.
Hi, my name's Gary McMahon. The story I'm going to read to you today came to me fully formed, really. It didn't take much work at all to get it down the first draft down on the page, which is very rare, so it's always a moment of treasure. It was first published in one of my collections, and then Alan Datlow picked it up and reprinted it in Best New Horror, which was Best Horror of the Year, which was very gratifying. And recently, actually 2 weeks ago, someone contacted me about making a short film out of it. So it's kind of one of those stories that seems to keep coming back. So I thought I'd read this one anyway. It's my favourite kind of tale one of my favourite kind of tales is a kind of a barroom tale, a shaggy dog story. And I like to think of this one as the kind of story if you walked into the wrong bar on the wrong night and sat next to the wrong person. They'd look at you through whiskey-sodden eyes and tell you a story like this one. So here we go. Tethered dogs. It was always quiet on weeknights in the Gut Punch, when the wild weekend crowds gave way to sombre men and women winding down with a drink after a hard day at work, lonely singletons or divorcees who didn't want to sit at home alone watching the TV soaps, and the other ones, the people who were committing a slow suicide by alcohol. It was my night off, but for some reason I couldn't stay away. If I'm honest, that seedy little bar is the only place that feels like home. Living alone doesn't make you lonely, but only lonely people tend to live alone. I smiled at the relief barman, Ledley, as I walked in, and he nodded slowly. There was a look in his eyes that I couldn't read. I took off my coat and hung it on a hook at the end of the bar and slipped onto one of the tall wooden stools. The usual? Thanks. Ledley flicked the switch on the ancient coffee machine and it started to grumble. I had no idea how old that thing was, how it still worked after all this time, but the coffee was always good. Slow night? He shrugged. It's a Monday, they're always slow. He glanced over my shoulder briefly, but long enough for me to notice. Any trouble this evening? No trouble, just a vibe, a bad one. He nodded at someone in the bar behind me and turned back to the coffee machine. His shaved head glistened as it caught the light from a nearby wall lamp. Slowly I slid around on the stool and surveyed the room. There were approximately a dozen drinkers in there, 2 small groups and 3 solitary figures. A woman sat reading a paperback and nursing a glass of wine. A young kid who looked somewhere between 19 and 23 was staring at his half-filled pint glass. A heavy-set man whose face I recognised sat alone in a booth, slowly turning a cardboard beer mat over and over in his hands. Him, said Ledley, nodding at the beer mat fiddler as he placed a steaming coffee cup in front of me. There was a little red Iron Man tattoo on the inside of his left forearm. He liked to keep fit. He was always training for some road race or triathlon. I just thought he was trying to outrun himself. I took a sip of the coffee and then stood, walked across the room. Halfway there I remembered the guy's name and where it was I knew him from. He was a heavy guy, into all kinds of stuff, but he'd never given me any trouble. All right, Joel? He looked up at me. His face was grey, not pale, but actually grey, as if he were on the verge of death. Jesus, mate, you look a bit rough. He smiled, but it made me feel uncomfortable. There was no humour in that smile, or anything even approaching human emotion. There was just a deep hole into which all the light could disappear. Are you okay? I'm not sure. If you want to be alone, I'll fuck off. No, I don't want to be alone. That's why I'm here. I need to be around people, part of a familiar scene. I sat down in a chair opposite him without being asked. Can I get you a drink? He looked at his empty glass, a confused expression on his face. I can't even remember drinking that. I turned to Ledley, motioned for him to pour Joel another pint, and then took a mouthful of wonderfully hot, bitter coffee, waited for him to tell me what was on his mind. We've known each other in passing for a few years, right? Yeah, that's right. I don't think we've ever had a conversation that lasted longer than a quick hello before now, have we? I shook my head. Not that I can recall, no. I suppose that would make us what they call nodding acquaintances. He smiled again. I wish he'd stopped doing that. It was making me feel nauseous. I don't have a lot of close friends, not real ones. You know something of what I do for a living, yeah? It's none of my business what you do. But you do know. You know I'm a bad man. We're all bad men in some way. I don't believe in white hats and good guys. That shit's for kids. I think he'd already decided he was going to tell me his story. Nothing I said could have altered that. He clenched his fists on the table and then eased off the pressure, slowly opening his hands. Something weird happened tonight. I'm going to tell you so I don't have to keep it inside my head. This is something I need to share, if only for my own sanity. Give me a second. I got up and collected his drink from the bar. Ledley didn't say anything, just stared at me as he pretended to clean glasses. When I returned to the booth, it looked like Joel had been trying not to cry. His eyes were red, but there were no tears. Here, I pushed a pint of ale towards him. Thanks, man. Joel drank half the contents in one swallow and then put down the glass. You know me, Joel. I'm not going to judge you. I've done a lot of bad things myself, so I can claim no moral high ground. We're just 2 blokes sitting in a pub and having a chat. He blinked once, slowly, as if he was trying to clear his vision, and then continued. One of my girls tried to kill herself tonight. She climbed onto the roof behind my place and jumped. I saw her do it. Her neck snapped when she hit the ground. It sounded like a gunshot. Who was it? Jenny Dope, the little junkie girl from Marsh Street. I know her. She's the one whose kid died in that road accident, isn't she? Yeah, 6 months ago now. It was no accident. A hit and run. Nobody ever found the guy who did it. He stared at me and I knew that contrary to popular belief someone had found him, but nobody else would ever know where the body was buried. Okay, say no more. Jenny couldn't deal with the loss. She'd gone rapidly downhill, taking more drugs, stronger ones, and drinking herself badly. Yeah, I heard a bit about that. Someone told me recently that she was selling herself for a hit from a dirty needle in some squat in East Leeds. I was trying to wean her off that shit. I took her out of that hovel and gave her a room. Thought I was actually getting somewhere. Until tonight. So she's dead. Kind of. His answer hit me right under the ribs, almost winding me. I didn't know how to respond, so I said nothing. I wished that I hadn't sat down with him in the first place, but by then it was too late to get up and go. Her neck snapped. Head was twisted all the way around, literally all the way, so that she was staring backwards. She wasn't breathing. I checked. Her heart wasn't beating. I checked that too. She should have been a goner. Should have, but wasn't. Not quite. In the depths of the brief silence that followed, when he stopped speaking and simply stared at me, I sensed so many things that should remain unknown. I smelled a hint of decay, heard a silent scream on the wind, felt the presence of someone or something I knew I'd meet again, face to face on my deathbed. She was dead, but she was still speaking. I don't know how or why. With her head turned back to front, she was gabbling, talking a lot of shit. Me and one of the boys carried her back inside and put her on a bed in one of the back rooms, the ones we don't let the customers use. The rooms where the girls can go for a rest and grab a bit of privacy. Clean sheets, new carpets, painted nice and bright. We had to lay her down on her front so that she was face up. Her eyes were open, but you could tell she couldn't see us. I had no idea what she was looking at. The jukebox in the corner started playing an old song, but I couldn't focus clearly enough to make out the words. All I could think of was this young girl with her head facing the wrong way, dead but still managing to speak. The thing is, she kept on talking. Couldn't stop. She kept with this strange monologue, reciting names and dates and causes of death. It took us a little while to realise that she was giving us the death dates of everyone she knew. Then she moved on to other things, predictions. She told us that 10 years from now there'll be a terrorist attack on the Houses of Parliament. Next week a family of 6 would be killed in a house fire in Sheffield. Stuff like that. And some things I can't even bring myself to repeat. Then what happened? I had to get the hell out of there, so I came here. I needed a drink and to be in the company of real people. We didn't call the police or the ambulance service. I mean, what the fuck was I meant to tell them? How do you explain a dead woman with her head twisted 180 degrees on her neck predicting death and destruction? It's crazy. They think I was insane. So she's still there? He nodded. We locked her in the room. You can still hear her droning on behind the door in that flat, lifeless voice. I don't know what to do. Neither did I. None of us ever knows what to do in times of great duress, but something always comes up. And round here, I'm usually the one who comes up with it. Show me, I said, and I have no idea why. It was none of my business. I didn't want to get involved. Yet I stood and followed him out with a gut punch, walked half a mile to his place in a quiet street that backs onto fields grown wild with neglect. The night was warm, the air was clear. I could see every star in the firmament. If I'd wanted to, I could have counted each one of them and given them names. Come on, this way. He opened the door and we walked along a short corridor, bedrooms branching off it, doors shut tight in their frames. I don't think there were customers behind any of those doors. Joe must have shut up shop after the last one left, his bowls and wallet emptied. We went into the kitchen of the converted house. A middle-aged woman sat in her underwear at the dining table drinking tea. She didn't look up at us as we passed through. Her mind was on other matters. A thin young man with bad complexion stood at her side, staring at the top of her head as if he could find the secret of existence within her greasy blonde curls. I don't think either of them was even aware of us being there. We left them behind. For a moment it felt like I was leaving everything behind. Those people, this house, my life, all of it. Joel stopped outside the door at the end of his narrow corridor. He stood and stared at the door, as if he were trying to wish it away, or convince himself that it wasn't really there, that a solid wall had appeared in its place. She's in here, he said, reaching out a hand and placing his palm against the painted timber. We didn't know what else to do. As I watched, he took a set of keys from his jacket pocket. Examining them, he selected one and used it to unlock the door. I could hear mumbling from inside the room. When he opened the door, the voice became clearer. It sounded like chanting or a repeated prayer. Joel stepped through the door and then to one side, giving me a view of the room. The walls were painted bright yellow. The carpet was clean and white. Pretty curtains hung at the small window. Flowers in a vase on the windowsill. I could smell lavender air freshener. There was a wardrobe, a small chest of drawers, a neat double bed. On the bed was a woman. She was small and thin and wearing a pair of tight black jeans and a faded Motorhead tour t-shirt. No shoes or socks. She had tiny feet, small nubs of toes. Her arms were bruised. Her neck was twisted in a kind of fleshy spiral as she lay on her belly, but face up, talking non-stop. Her voice was quiet, but she wasn't quite whispering. It sounded like an old recording, flat, distant, lacking tone and timbre. I didn't want to hear what she was saying. Names, dates, numbers, causes of death. It sounded like she was reading from a list. She hasn't stopped. She won't. She just keeps on talking, telling us these things. We don't know what to do. I remember this girl from before, when she used to push a pram through the park and pick wild flowers to put in her baby's hair. She'd been as happy as anyone I'd ever seen, but even then she'd been using and working occasionally in Joel's grotty little suburban whorehouse. The shadows were already gathering. Darkness had never been far from her side. I'd walked into a trap. Joel was relinquishing all responsibility for this girl by bringing me here. He knew enough about me to be certain I'd do the right thing, the thing that he couldn't bring himself to do. It was always the same. People dragged me into their business and expected me to sort it out. I spent my life cleaning up other people's messes and don't expect things to change anytime soon. They seek me out. It's like a mark upon my skin, a stain on my flesh. They can see it when they look at me. They know I can never turn them down when they come to me for help. We all have a role to play, and this, it appears, is mine. I felt like punching Joel in the face, but I knew that if I got started on that I might not stop until I'd killed him. He looked pathetic, standing in the corner with his eyes shining and his shoulders stooped. He was already a beaten man. Anything that I could have done would have added little to his current sense of defeat. It was then that I realised what he must have been told by the girl on the bed, the date of his own death, and how it would come about. I wondered if she told him he would be murdered, or if he would go quietly in his sleep. Would he die young or old? If he was to be murdered, had she named his killer? These are the things that we can never know, for it will break our minds. The secret knowledge must not be told. We dance through life unaware of the date of our own extinction. It's the only thing that stops us from losing our sanity. To know that, to be informed of it with such unwavering certainty, is surely the definition of hell on earth. I turned my attention back to the girl on the bed. Did she know that I was here? I didn't want her to tell me anything about myself. A bell once struck can't be unrung. A scream cannot be unheard. Quickly, quietly, I stepped forward and stood by the bed, staring down at Jenny Dope. Her eyes were wide open, but she couldn't see a thing. She wouldn't even know what was happening. Her shoulder blades were sharp beneath the thin material of her t-shirt. Her spine was prominent. She looked used up, wasted. I reached down and clasped her head, a hand on each side of a small sweaty skull, and twisted hard, turning her head back the right way. The bones grated, blood spurted from her mouth as she coughed involuntarily, staining the pillow red. She stopped speaking mid-sentence. I was glad she hadn't yet said my name. I left her lying face down on the bed, silent at last. Joel tried to follow me out of the room as I left, but I turned and pushed him away. He was smart enough to stay where he was. The couple in the kitchen were standing, locked in a loose embrace as I walked through the room and towards the front door. It looked like they were slow dancing to a tune only they could hear. Outside, everything was the same as it always had been. Nothing had changed. The sky was still above me. The earth remained solid beneath my feet. My life was a mess. My job was pointless, and my children were still on the other side of the world, growing up without me in their lives. I heard a song comprising of distant sirens and the barking of tethered dogs as I headed back to the gut punch, not knowing where else to go. It was the best home I had, the only one I knew. When I got there, I stood outside the building and stared up at the roof, wondering how long it would take me to climb up to its highest level and how far I might see when I got there. The journey would be much quicker on the way back down. Jenny Dope had known that better than anyone, even at the end. I stayed there for a long time, until finally, feeling tired and useless and sick of myself, I stalked away into the muggy northern night, looking for something I would never find, searching for something, anything, that I could pretend was better than this. Thank you.
Nella notte lupi aurivi, cantantes libidi dal suon, transporter audiri, ululatum ston.
Tempus sacrifici nunc, tempus sacrifici nunc, tempus sacrifici nunc, tempus sacrifici.
Hi. Greetings from the wet and misty Pacific Northwest of the United States. I'm Glen Hirshberg, and I am delighted to be with you First of all, I want to thank Joe for inviting me to be part of this. Much appreciated. The whole experience and the whole idea of this is reminding me of the Rolling Darkness Review, which was a performing ghost story tour that the late, great, and much missed Dennis Etchison and the lovely Peter Atkins and I dreamed up in 2004. And Pete and I especially mostly spent 10 years every Halloween season touring the show up and down the west coast of the United States primarily. We performed in basement bookstores and in little theaters and in a haunted wine cave, and we had a great time. We sure hope that the people who came to see it did too. So, that show really, by the time Pete and I finished with it, it evolved into quite the multimedia thing. We had a house band that we performed with that did background music. Pete and I had personas that we assumed, Algie and Artie, named for the great ghost story writers Algernon Blackwood and Arthur Mackin, favorites of ours. And so, in honor of the Rolling Dark and of all the fun we had during those years, I'm going to once more don my Artie Mackin hat. And then I'm going to read you a story. So this story is called Jetty Sarah. It's from my most recent collection, which is called Tell Me When I Disappear, available from Cemetery Dance and all fine online retailers. And the story is based on an actual event, a tsunami that struck the northern California city of Crescent City over half a century ago, or a half century ago. So, here's a story called Jetty Sarah. Safe and warm inside the Brother J diner, hands around coffee mugs or tomato juices and mouths full of crab scramble, we watch the rain chase Lee down the street. It's yipping at his heels, leaping on his back, and he's shuddering like a sheephound by the time he flings open the door and staggers inside. Shut that, Lulu Bell shouts from her corner table. For form's sake, since she's around behind the fireplace and not one drop of wet is reaching her this morning. Dutifully, the rest of us take up the cry, and Lee swings his head toward us, which sets a wave of water plunging off his hood down his face. He gives the whole room his snarl, then he slams the door. But he's Lee, and by now he's grinning through his personal downpour. How about we open the windows, get some air in? He takes one of the last available seats. It's too near the door, but most of us are already here, as usual when the storms roll in, so it's not likely he'll suffer much. He flops into his chair, does his sheephound shiver, but he doesn't even get coffee in his mouth before Fresnel Tom snaps out of his slouch at the far end of the room as though someone has clicked him on. He stares back down the street the way Lee came, toward all our tiny houses. Ah, shit, he says. She's out. All around the Brother J, forks fill with crab scramble, fly up toward faces, cram in. We know what's coming. Who? Lee says, mid-chew. Again, for form's sake. Also, because he just got here, wants at least to get warm. God damn, says Fresnel Tom. I thought she moved, Brother J calls from behind the counter. But he's coming out into the room, already heading toward the coat rack. Why would you think that? Lulu Bell snaps. Only one way that chica's leaving Swope City. The wet one, murmurs old Ellis, and Lulu Bell swats him hard as he stands. Shut up. You shut up, he snaps back, but he stands too. Then we're all at the window. The rain's crashing down so fat and hard we don't see her at first, except for Nell Tom, obviously, he's already seen her. It's also pre-dawn dark at 11 in the morning, so mostly what we see is our own faces. Cluster of fishermen and ex-fishermen and fishermen's widows and widowers, floating there in the glass as though under water. That's not a thought any of us likes, not around here, and then Fresnel Tom points, and old Ellis, who isn't older than the rest of us, just looks at, sighs. Shit. Yep. She's so thin, even with that flappy black rain shell whipping around her. She looks like some sort of torn loose sapling tumbling on the gusts, except she's tumbling into them. Her hair is still the same color as that jacket, oil slick black, only without any swirls of color where light catches. Her skin, what we can see of it between spits of rain, flying hair, isn't exactly pallid, isn't any color really, the color of sidewalk, a surface you walk on. Pobre chica, Lulabelle murmurs. Pathetic bitch, says Lee, even though it's his fault she's out there. He's the one who told her the story. No one swats him. No one argues. 12 years since the sea did this whole town a solid, sucked her, John, and his whole monstrous crew off our streets and out of our lives. But everyone here still has memories. Probably everyone has some they haven't even shared. Well, come on, says Brother Jay, flipping up his hood. You come on, says old Ellis, again, for form's sake. He's already zipping in. We all are. We wait a few seconds longer until she's well past, halfway down the hill to the beach. Not that she'll see us or care if she does. Pobre chica on a mission. That's our Sarah. Lee's coat is still dripping so hard it's like he's got a personal rainstorm right on top of him. It makes Fresnel, Tom, and Lulabelle laugh. Hilarious, says Lee. He pulls the door open, and we're out in it. The downpour has actually slackened some, but the wind's up, and it shoves against us as we trail along toward the water. Reminds us of those days, that one horrible year, when they were among us, John and his crew. The shoves when they passed us constant, casual, like we were doors to throw open, cats to kick, not people at all. Sources at best of supplies they might need, of sons they could hook on whatever cut product they'd scored and couldn't offload in Eureka or Medford. Daughters to rape. Yo-ho, one of us, probably old Ellis, murmurs, and the shudder whips through our whole group. If it's a pirate's life for you, you better be goddamn sure you're a pirate. Look at her, says Lee. He sounds regretful, apologetic, which is ridiculous. No one blames him. He was trying to help, same as we all have at one point or other. Straight for the goddamn jetty. That's where she's headed, all right. Across the beach, feet catching in stands of washed-up kelp, and trailing them behind her, which makes her look like some skeletal black fish wriggling free of a net. Her black hair whips and flaps. Move it, says Lulabelle, but we're already picking up the pace. From the top of the hill at the edge of the town, all you can see is harbor. But even that's shuddering today, the boats tilting and turning on their tie ropes, banging against their berths or the dock like bells being rung. Of course, you can barely hear them over the ocean. Halfway down the hill, we see the sea, and then we move even faster. Come back, Sarah, Lee bellows abruptly, his voice boomeranging right around in his face. There's no way she could hear him, not over all that roaring and smacking and splashing. Even if she could, there's no way she would listen. By the time we've hit the beach, she's up on the jetty, head down, marching straight through that gauntlet of state-generated warning tsunami zone signs. Then the homemade ones we put up, partly for tourists, mostly for her. The one with the stick figures tumbling into heaving abyss over the words, tsunamis, seriously. The one we had painted right onto metal of the wreckage of this harbor in January of '64. Surprisingly, just as we reach the edge of the water and take up post in the lee of our ridiculous Swope City light, Sarah half turns our way. We get a good look at her sidewalk-skinned face. With a jolt that hits us all together, a wave crashing in. We remember what she looked like. Then, right before John and his crew came. While they were there, too, if we're honest. Just as thin, but majestic somehow, grown into herself, lean and wild. She's gone all beaky now, like some wounded seabird abandoned by the flock, skimming the beach to scavenge leavings. She isn't looking at or responding to us, needless to say. She's seen something in the water. Thinks she has. Stops for a second, starts to crouch. Ah, fuck, says Fresnel Tom. Old Ellis shivers, then we're all doing it. We watch, shivering until she straightens. For one magical second, she looks like she's coming back this way. Then she glances up into the rain, raises both arms, and flips us the bird. Birds. Spinning away, she launches again down that spit of rock and pavement. Our imaginary divide between Swope City and open ocean that we still catch ourselves imagining keeps us safe. Time after time, in spite of everything. Spray flies up around her with every step, as though she's causing it, like a little girl puddle jumping. Pretty soon, from where we stand, it's hard to see Jetty at all. She looks like she's walking on water, hiking straight out to sea. We're not close enough now, and we know it. If the worst comes, wave, sure, but more likely, her deciding just to go ahead and jump, fling herself into the arms of the man she seems utterly sure is waiting for her just below the surface. We'll never reach her in time. We should go out there with her. At least a few of us are pretty clearly going to have to today. At least the rain is thinned. Even the wind is sputtering, spitting gusts, but no longer hurling itself in our faces. The ocean's still slamming around out there, but it's gone a lighter gray. Looks more like it does when it lets people near or on it. Frisky-like. I'll go, says Brother Jay. Me too, says Lee, but neither of them move yet. Sarah stayed standing instead of kneeling out there on her jetty, and she's not moving much. Again, there's something bird-like about her, like a hovering gull holding its place in the currents of air. Oh, God damn it, says Fresnel Tom, but not about Sarah, and he steps off the sand to the side of the jetty and splashes through the shore water toward the lighthouse. We call it a lighthouse. I guess it is. It's still hard to believe it ever really worked. It's tall enough, I suppose, a good 20 feet high, and it has withstood more than its share of weather. But the land it is slowly sinking into was never a raised point, is blocked from sight of most open water by the curve of the coast, and isn't even accessible when the tide's up and the water completely covers the narrow sandy spit connecting it to the beach. Tom's been working on it for years, scraping decades-deep coatings of bird shit off the sides and getting new glass made for the windows and seeing to the machinery. Even so, it looks mostly like a model lighthouse that washed up here from somewhere. Cracked concrete, a rusted metal door that Tom keeps boring new bolts into and which the ocean keeps pushing open and rushing through. Leaning tower of lighthouse. Reaching the door, Tom stares down at the water gushing over his feet and inside, laying on yet another layer of damp upon damp. He bangs the door with his fist and it rings. "Ah, hon," says Lulubelle. Not about Tom, we know. And we all swing together again toward the jetty. Sarah's still not kneeling, not yet. But she's all leaned over, staring down as the splash hurls itself up the stones over her boots. She has her hands out straight and her mouth has started moving. If you didn't know better, had never stood near enough when she gets like this, you could mistake what she's doing for conjuring. What she's really up to is worse, of course. Breaks your heart every time. She's cooing. Brother Jay makes a clucking noise, part sympathy, part disbelief. "It's like she really believes it, you know?" "It's not like that at all," murmurs Lee. Then says it again louder because it's hard to make him out over the whapping water and he wants us to hear his regret. She does. Right on cue, down she drops. Her hands, at least for now, are back in the pockets of her windbreaker, but they won't stay there. She's not leaning yet, anyway. Then she is. There's no way we can see her face. Too much spray flying around, like the world's being painted into being, or chipped out of being, right in front of us. But every single one of us knows she's smiling. It's our oldest city tale, the one we've all not just heard, but told. Practically our motto. In high summer, on the right night, with the Brother Jay humming and the midnight crab scrambles flying, some caught-up tourist or other will ask the right question of the right person, and just like that, we'll be reciting. Faces in the waves. The way, in storms, the water sometimes gives you glimpses of people it has taken from you. Their visages so solid, so precisely as you best remember them, that you expect them to open their watery mouths and gurgle hello. This is what passes when you live by the grace of the ocean, for mercy. On the jetty, amid the rioting spray, our Sarah stretches out her hands. It's not raining anymore. For whatever difference that makes. There's so much wet flying around in the air, it's a wonder we can breathe it. Another old Swope City tale. Half-gilled we are. Like begging him to take her, Lulubelle murmurs, something very near a catch in her voice. Or else simply wind-borne wetness. We're watching hard now. When she leans forward even a little more, which she will, any second, we're going to have to move. Make sure we're closer. If it were really him, says old Ellis, he fucking would. Not for love, for sheer meanness. If it were him, says Brother Jay, he wouldn't stop at her. For no reason we can see, Sarah glances back in our direction, stares hard. Seems to anyway. We all feel it. Maybe she's telling him to go ahead. It takes longer than usual today. She's got her hands out and we're pretty sure her mouth's still moving, but she's just crouched there. And the spray riots around her for so long that she almost melts into the landscape. Jetty, leaning lighthouse, ship masts in the harbor, cloud mass, darker cloud mass, and our Sarah. Beacon, buoy, something on which to focus so you can watch the world roll. Every single one of us. Tom, too, from up in his beloved light, is watching, looking right at her, mesmerized in the way looking at that ocean does that to you. A miraculous cleansing sensation on the right day, transcendental, a reason to stay. And yet, somehow, not a single one of us sees. How is that possible? We see her, okay. Don't process, but we all see. Her reared back, not leaning forward. Arms straight out in front, palms forward. Not defensive, but not reaching either. Words fly from her mouth like whitewater, hang in the air. It should be terrifying. The fact that we can hear her. We've had it wrong, we all think together, as one thought, one thing thinking, not a bunch of town nobodies living our separate, grieving, peaceful nobody lives. Then Lee says, "Oh." Even then it takes us a second we do not have to understand, to make sense of the fact that we aren't collectively imagining what our Sarah is saying, but really hearing it. Because the wind hasn't just dwindled, it has dropped off the face of the world. The sea hasn't just ceased slapping and slamming, but vanished, literally is not there. The boats in the harbor clunk as they drop down on rocks and sand that moments ago were bottom. The jetty looms suddenly towering like the top of a just-risen island, brand new and streaming. There's a moment of blissful silence like no one in Swope City has experienced ever during 1 second of our lives on this earth. Finally, one of us screams, "Run!" Not just at Sarah, but all of us. By this point, we're already running, obviously, as if running could make any possible difference now. At some level, we really are one entity, at least in this instant. No one makes any decision. Certainly no one calls out commands. But there we all are, lunging instinctively across the exposed sand toward the lighthouse. Tom is up top, watching us, not the sea, the not sea, absence of sea, and screaming. We're all screaming, just not words. Except Sarah. She's screaming words. The silence gets swallowed. That's the best I can do to describe it. It doesn't erupt or shatter. It's simply subsumed. As we tumble, screaming through the lighthouse door, swing together to paw and shove at it in a desperate attempt to get it shut, as if shutting that door is going to matter. Lulubelle stops just long enough to glance outward, to see. "So many faces," she whispers, except she can't possibly be whispering because we couldn't possibly hear her. The rest of us never see. We just somehow sense it roaring in, less trampling the world than rolling it up, sucking it into itself. It's not a wave. That's a ridiculous word for it. It's not a wall either. It's the world folding over, slamming itself shut. Some of us are up the stairs with Tom, some of us still on the stairs when it hits. After that, for who knows how long, probably not very long, not in time as we have charted it up until then, before realizing that time is as fragile and mutable and imaginary as everything else we have ever collectively decided equals living. There is no sound but roar. No thought, no sensation, not even panic. We are all tumbled together, twisted around each other, but we're not even aware of our own bones and bodies, let alone anyone else's. Not only are there no words, there's no reason for words. Nothing to communicate. Just nothing. From outside, old Ellis will say later, it must have looked almost funny. Miraculous, sure, but also ridiculous. Almost as absurd as being awake and alive at all. Somehow, our lighthouse keels slowly, all the way over, like a giant's hand is lowering us to the ground, leaving us lying there twisted together, soaked and floating, banged and bruised, barely really rumpled at all. It takes a while to figure out which way is up, meaning out, and then disentangle, crawl toward the gaping spaces where the lens windows had been, and into the open air and reeking wet, which is already receding. The Swope City miracle. None of us named it that in the moment. Somehow, that was already what this was. The biggest tsunami ever to hit this coast, pouring all the way up our hill and out the other side of town, flooding buildings, knocking down road signs, killing no one, not one person, except Sarah, obviously. Every single night, we gather at the Brother J since then, among tourists, all together, alone, whatever. and we raise our tomato juices to her. We're not exactly toasting, not apologizing, not even memorializing, just acknowledging. We've never talked about what we saw, what we heard. There's no need. We figured it out on our own. Sarah on her knees, on her jetty, her hands outstretched like that. Not as though reaching for her lover, more soothing a big cat, stroking its humped up fur, telling it no. No, babe, no. Let them go. Thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed that. Again, it's a pleasure to be with you. And thanks, Joe.
Nella notte lupi audivi, cantanti stipiti nel suon, transpondeva udivi, urula
Tempus sacrifici nunc, tempus sacrifici nunc, tempus sacrifici nunc, tempus sacrifici.
Until I saw his name in the newspaper that day, I hadn't thought about David Rowley in over 20 years. Actually, I guess I'd been trying not to think of him. Time moves on, people grow up, and even best friends can grow apart. But when there's an incentive to forget, when some part of people's shared past is so inexplicable, so terrible, it never goes away. You can push it deeper, like a splinter, but it's always going to be there. I'd been on my way out to work that morning when I read his name. I'd picked the newspaper up, ready to throw it away. It was a free local paper, and I rarely had time to do more than glance at it. But his name jumped out at me and hit me like a truck. I sat back down, and by the time I'd read the brief article, the memories were already forcing themselves into my mind. I felt ill. I felt cold and clammy. I felt sick to my stomach. I could have called in sick, but I didn't. I stood over the sink into the kitchen until I was certain I wasn't going to throw up. Then I drank a glass of water, picked up my car keys and left the house. I didn't want to be alone. I didn't want to have any more time to think. Impossible, of course. The past is always there, right behind us, just where it can be the most dangerous. Rowley had been my closest friend for a number of years in high school. He hadn't any others, through no fault of his own. His father was an abusive drunk, a thoroughly unpleasant man who I'd never heard a good word said about. His mother had left them both some years previously, obviously deciding that the son wasn't worth a father. I think Dave had heard from her occasionally, but we were teenagers. We didn't talk about things like that. We didn't discuss any of the emotional stuff, and I think men never really do. We tried to keep it light, veering away from anything meaningful with a laugh and a flippant comment. It all falls into the spaces between the words, and those spaces end up as some very deep pits. But Dave himself was okay. He could be withdrawn at times, but once you knew his situation, that was understandable. He had a quick temper and a brooding manner. Sometimes his attention wandered and his schoolwork suffered. His father didn't pay out for much, and so he never had new clothes, trainers, school bag. Everything he owned was old, didn't quite fit, frayed and faded. And these things matter when you're that age. You get judged on them. He never got to go on any school trips. He could never invite people round to his house, and so the distance between him and the other kids grew wide enough that nobody ever bothered to cross it. Fate threw us together early on when a teacher put us both together in class. I gave him a chance and stuck with him. I saw a side of him that nobody back then ever saw. He lived in a large, ugly council house across town from me. It was a half-hour walk to get there, but I never minded. We didn't usually stay in his house. Even if his father was out or sleeping off his latest almighty hangover, the place had a miserable atmosphere. Clothes were strewn about along with unwashed plates and mugs. Rubbish overflowed from the bin in the kitchen, which always smelt of grease. The wallpaper was faded, in places falling away altogether. None of the mess was Dave's. His own small room was as spotless as any teenage boy's could be expected to be, and he was obviously embarrassed by the state of the house. It seemed to me as though some vital spark had gone out of the place when his mother had left. The elements of family life, perhaps. But then again, I'd never known her. Maybe it had always been that shitty. Instead, if weather allowed it, and even sometimes when it didn't, we went out walking. Being on the edge of town, we had the best of both worlds. We could wander through the streets, though they were mostly run-down estates, and we had to be feeling in the mood for the possibility of a scrap. Mostly, though, we went the other way, into the countryside. The scenery wasn't exactly beautiful, but it was a world away from anything else that Dave knew, and that was enough. I remember the track we used to take, through a gate in a high steel fence that seemed to have been wedged open and into place with age, and down a meandering path surrounded by hugely overgrown weeds that led up to the concrete walls of the backyards of neighbouring houses. Before long, the houses dropped away and the land did too. A steep slope that could be treacherous in wet weather. The woods awaited, scrappy as they were, and we followed their call. A day in early October. The afternoon was darkening, but we'd still have enough light for a couple of hours. We kicked our way through the dust and the dirt and the leaves, ruining our already battle-weary school shoes. Something rustled through the undergrowth. Distantly, a car backfired. Soon we could leave the sounds of the streets behind, if only for a little while. "Are you still seeing Helen?" Dave asked me. I don't know if he really cared. His mind seemed somewhere else, but then again it often did. It's just how he was. I accepted it. I don't know. I'm not sure. I haven't really spoken to her since Marie's party. "You'll miss all the hot sex." I laughed. "Yeah, right. I wish. I bet Helen could be hot." "You think?" I raised a cynical eyebrow. I kind of liked Helen, had hung around with her for a handful of weeks, but it seemed to be going nowhere. But I was 15. My hormones were tearing me apart, and I took female company where I could get it, desperate for something more. "Sure, the quiet ones are always the filthiest. She'd go off like a firework." I punched him in the shoulder, only light, but enough to raise a cry of protest. "Hey," I laughed, "that's my girl you're talking about." "No, it isn't," he replied, rubbing his shoulder but grinning at last. "Not anymore." I sighed, kicked a rock into the trees as far as it could go. "Yeah, you're probably right. I think I'm back on the market." "The flea market? Fuck off. What about you? Not tired of tossing yourself off all the time? Can't find anyone else to do it for you?" "If you're offering, then I'll have to politely decline." Dave skipped out of reach of another punch. We skirted what we used to call the pond, but which was just a dip in the path where rainwater collected and grew repulsively stagnant. The rusted framework of a child's bicycle poked out of it. "No, I'm serious. I thought you and Louise Carter were going to get together at the end of last term. What happened?" The mood took a dive. Dave's grin faded. He looked away from me, watched his step as we descended deeper into the woods. "What have I got to offer a girl?" he muttered, and I hadn't the words or the maturity to pursue that one any further. All I could offer was my dumb friendship, and hope that it was enough. We worked our way through the woods, gradually getting back to something approaching our more usual mood through a series of grunts and gestures as we progressed. It didn't take long before we reached the small clearing that we generally considered our base. The trees around the edge of the clearing formed a fairly tight canopy overhead, which shut out the light on all but the brightest of days, but kept us fairly dry and warm on the worst of them. There was an old fallen tree that made a great bench once we brushed off the gathered moss and bugs. This particular day, the day when I guess it really all started to go crazy, we found the stick figures. Dave noticed the first one, and then I noticed another, and then it seemed they were everywhere. I don't know how many there were in the clearing and around the edges of it. We found maybe a dozen, I don't remember for certain, and maybe there were dozens more in amongst the trees, unseen. I don't want to think about that. "Hey, look at this," Dave said as he stooped to pick up the first one. Right away, I didn't like it. "What is it?" "I don't know." He shrugged as though the matter was unimportant, but he kept hold of it as he headed across to the fallen tree. "There's more of them," I said, pushing one out of my path with a gentle nudge. I didn't want to kick it. I felt wary of them. I wonder who made them. The figures were all roughly similar. Without studying them closer, it was hard to be sure. The one Dave had hold of was about 6 inches tall and made of twigs twisted around each other and bound into something approximating a human form. As he turned it in his hands while speaking, the gaps between the twigs seemed to make eyes, a mouth, alive, moving. I hated looking at it, but didn't like to take my eyes off it for too long. We straddled the tree trunk like we'd done countless times before, and we talked of school, of lessons we hated, of teachers we hated, of other kids that we hated. We spoke in vague terms of bigger themes in life, of hopes and fears for our futures, of jobs we'd heard paid great money, of places we'd want to live or even just to visit. "I know this much," I said. "I'm getting out of this town." "Yeah," Dave said and tailed off. He looked down at the stick figure and I saw something in his eyes. I don't know. I remember it now as a light, a kind of a light that either went on or off inside of him. And he looked up at me and said, "Do you really mean it? About getting out of here, getting away?" "Of course," I said, and I did mean it. It wasn't something I ever gave much thought to. I just knew that my future was somewhere else. This place is a dump. Nothing ever happens here and nothing ever will. "But do you think it's possible to get away?" "Sure I do, don't you? I thought you wanted the same." I do. I mean, it's just..." He sighed, frustrated either at his lack of words or just lack of understanding of what it was that he was feeling. "I just don't know if it will ever be that easy. Not for you, maybe, but for me. I feel like whatever I want to do in life, it'll all come to nothing. I feel like I'm always going to be held back. I fucking hate my life. I'd love to get away from it all, but it's that bastard. I just look at him and I see no hope. I don't want him as my father. I don't want to be near him. I don't want to be anything like him. If I could be rid of him, I would be." He stopped talking and his eyes had a sheen about them that I didn't recognise. "Is it really that bad?" I felt like I had to say something, though my question seemed redundantly dumb. Maybe the question itself didn't matter because Dave barely seemed to register it. He had badness inside, and it needed to come out. You don't understand. You can't imagine what it's like to live with it day after day. I hate it. I dread going home, dread him still being there, and if he isn't, then I dread him coming back. The longer he's not around, the more of a state I get myself into. I can't stay away from home because he just gets pissed off if I'm not there to shout at. And anyway, where can I go? I know what everyone at school says about me, how they talk and laugh behind my back. Fuck them. Every night I ask God why he has to put me through this, why I can't just live a normal life, have a chance to be normal, you know? And every day it just starts all over again. I honestly don't know how much more I can take. I reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. Other than roughhousing, we never touched each other. It felt weird. I don't know if he even noticed it. I just wanted him to know that he had a friend, even if it was fuck all I could do. And then I think that there isn't a God, you know? He looked up at me and there was something in his eyes that clutched at my heart. A painful, hopeless emptiness. A void that no boy should have ever had within him. I've always thought that there must be something up there, out there, wherever, something looking down on us, something with some kind of power over us. But maybe it isn't good, you know? How can it be when you think of all the shit that goes on? Maybe it gets off on being mean, on being vicious, or maybe it just doesn't care. Would that be worst of all, if it didn't care either way? I could have spoken, maybe I did, I don't remember doing, but anything I said would have been a token response. I hadn't been raised in an overly religious household, and I didn't really believe in anything myself. At best, I thought life was just some wonderful accident with no design to it at all, no real purpose. We just existed, and the sensible people made the most of it, the rest just sat around questioning it. I feel differently now, but it's still not something I care to dwell upon. But how clearly I still remember Dave sitting there in that gathering darkness beneath the twisted old trees, his eyes gleaming with hatred and hurt, his hands clutching that unnatural and inexplicable stick figure. And how clearly I remember his words. I want him gone. I didn't see Dave again for some time. He should have been in school the next day, and he wasn't, nor the day after that. I can't remember how many days he was gone, only that when I saw him again, the black eye hadn't quite faded, and the busted lip hadn't quite gone down. I'm sure at some point a teacher must have took him aside and spoke to him, but I'm also sure this had probably happened before and it never led anywhere. I know there was a lot of laughter from the other kids about it, and not all of them had the decency to do it behind his back. We went to the woods after school and he didn't talk about it or anything much. I felt the weight of all the unspoken words. It made me nervous, made me uncomfortable. Something was twisting in my gut. I didn't know what, if anything, I could say or do to help. That's the thing about other people's problems. Sometimes all we can do is stand on the sidelines and watch them battle through, however much we care. The stick figures were there again, or still there. They may have been the same ones, they may have been different ones, I don't know, and maybe it doesn't matter. Dave picked one up, stared at it. He sat down and wouldn't stop looking at the fucking thing all the time we were there. He said, and I remember this vividly, "It's my father." I don't know what he meant by that. It looked the same as any of the other damn things we'd seen. Or maybe it was a little... No. It's no good. I saw nothing. We left when darkness set in. though beneath those trees it seemed to close in too thick and too fast. I was glad to get out, and even more glad when we reached the streets again and marched between the lights from pool to pool of a sickly glare. Lights came on in the houses, lives going on behind closed curtains. Dave still carried that fucking stick figure with him, and he was breaking it up as we went along, twisting off small parts of it and dropping them to the pavement, almost as though he was leaving a trail all the way to his door. That thought occurred to me then, and I didn't like it. I like it even less now. I didn't sleep too well that night. Something was coming for me out of the woods. At the very least, in my dreams it was. I heard branches creaking and scraping at the glass, though there were no trees close enough to my parents' house for that to be anything but a dream, and for years afterwards I was thankful for that. I saw moonlight, or some kind of light, shining through twisted branches. I saw them weaving around themselves to form some kind of shape, but knew that if I lived to see its final form, then it would be the last thing I did see before it came for me. I struggled through the next day at school as if I were wading through a sludgy pond. Perhaps it was my remoteness that made Dave wait until lunchtime to pull me aside in the schoolyard, behind a low wall that mostly sheltered us from the running, screaming chaos of playtime, though not from the sight and stink of the bins that contained most of the scrapings from a canteen. "Look at this," he urged, and opened his school bag and pulled out one of the stick figures. Instantly, I recoiled, both mentally and physically. "What are you doing with that?" I asked. "Did you go back there on your own?" "I found it on my doorstep this morning. It's the same one." I didn't want to ask what he meant by that, and nor did I have to. I was trying to keep my mind empty, especially of the image of something coming out of the woods and following the trail he, had left for it the previous evening. "It can't be the same one," I told him, or myself, but my voice was so flat and so quiet that it carried even less conviction than I felt, which was, admittedly, next to none. "Why didn't it come for him?" Dave hissed and stuffed the figure back into his bag. This time, I did need some clarification. "What do you mean?" "I fucking dared. The bastard. Why didn't whatever it was come for him? Why did it just leave this on the doorstep? I thought..." He'd worked himself up, and then he suddenly stopped, almost as though embarrassed by the tears that were about to spill. He looked away, knuckled at his eyes, barked something that might have been a laugh. "Can you stay at mine tonight?" he asked. I was torn, believe me. I still felt as though there was more I should be doing to help my friend, and yet I really didn't want to be around his father. My wordless response must have told him this, because he then added, "Don't worry, he won't do anything if you're around." "Okay," I mumbled, and the relief on his face must have equalled the anxiety I felt. The rest of the day flew by as though time itself was eager to be over and done with whatever the night had in store. Dave's father would be working until 7, he told me, and so he tagged along as I went home to square it with my own parents. I wasn't at all sure what Dave's father did as a job, and it never felt the right moment to express an interest in the man. My mother tried pressing some food on us, but Dave reassured her we'd eat at his house. He seemed eager to be away, though I'm pretty sure that was just so his father couldn't get home before he did. We walked, and the colour drained out of the sky. Trees groped towards us from the roadside. Their branches shook as though something unseen was pacing us through them. I'd never stayed at Dave's house before, and right now seemed the worst of all possible times to do so, but if it meant his father would lay off him for a night, then surely I was being brave on his behalf. Surely it meant I was protecting him. But Dave seemed preoccupied, worried instead of reassured. I tried talking to him and would pull him out of a reverie into which he would soon sink again. His eyes darted to the shadows that gathered around us as the streetlights flickered on. Once or twice, I even caught him looking back over his shoulder. It was dark by the time we reached his house. Above us, a sky pressed down that would have been black had the streetlights not lent it the orange taint. Dave's house was in the middle of a warren of streets, rough, run-down houses with yards that seemed to be competing with one another for which could look most unloved. Some were home to cars that looked as though they hadn't been roadworthy for longer than I'd been alive. Some were scattered with broken fragments of children's play equipment. Some were paved over and decorated with dog shit. The occasional gang of teenagers or younger grouped on street corners, in bus shelters with broken panes of glass or beneath streetlights. They let us pass with nothing more than surly glances and the occasional comment designed to see if we wanted to fight. We let ourselves in through a gate that dragged across the path, and when Dave opened the front door, the house breathed a stale, unwashed smell at us. I could tell from the set of his face as we stepped inside that he was embarrassed by the house and wouldn't normally have chosen to invite me in. Still, here we were, and he reached past me to lock the door and shut us inside with whatever the night had in store for us. His father wasn't due home for another hour, and probably not even then. We spent the time in his bedroom, a small rectangle barely bigger than a single bed, listening to music on a cheap cassette player. The music was quiet, at a level obviously learned from his father's previous objection to hearing it from outside the room. After a while, he asked me if I was hungry, and I really wasn't, but I said yes, just for something to break the tension, to alleviate the feeling that we were merely waiting for something unavoidable and unpleasant. Sometime later, the slamming of a door announced his father's homecoming. Dave jumped up from the bed, and I wondered if he was wary of his father bursting in and finding us sitting on it together. But he turned the music even lower and dashed out of the door, saying, "I'd better just tell him you're here." I couldn't help feeling that he would use my presence as a form of protection for himself that night, but that I'd expected as much all along. I heard voices in the hallway downstairs. Dave's was recognisable, though so quiet that I couldn't make out the words, and his father's voice was low and ugly, that of a brute, though probably one under enforced good behaviour when he realised that an outside presence was listening. The voices seemed to burrow beneath the bed as the two went into the kitchen, and my heart pounded until Dave returned safely to the bedroom. "Is he going to be all right?" I asked gruffly, not wanting to become involved in any trouble, but wanting to sound brave. Dave nodded. "He won't try anything when you're here. I'll be safe for one night at least." Nevertheless, we kept things quiet. We both had a little homework to do and threw ourselves into the task with a lot more focus and energy than we would normally muster. That evening felt like it lasted forever. At one point, Dave's father yelled out for him and Dave raced downstairs. He came back sometime later and pulled a face but said nothing. I think he'd seen that his father started drinking and was worried what trouble he might cause. As it was, aside from the occasional roar from downstairs, he didn't do anything. That wasn't the worst part of the night. That wasn't what we truly had to be afraid of. At some point, his father stomped upstairs. We heard him pissing all over the bathroom and falling into the door and punching it. We heard him swearing at his own feet as they did their best to trip him up and send him tumbling down the stairs. We heard him make his way across the small landing and slam his bedroom door shut, collapse onto the bed and almost immediately begin snoring. By this time, we'd long since turned off the music and the light and were pretending to be asleep ourselves. I'd made up a bed on the narrow strip of floor. My held breath finally escaped from me, and I heard Dave gasping with similar relief. Perhaps it was that relief which let us sleep. For the next thing I knew, something else had caused my eyes to open, and I saw shadows crawling across the patch of light cast through the thin curtains by the streetlights outside. The room was sketched in a murky grey-orange, but most of it was still black. Black so dense that it seemed to swarm. Perhaps that wasn't entirely an illusion, though, for I could hear something moving within the room. It hardly seemed possible for the noise to be in here with us, for the only thing I could relate it to was the creaking of tree branches in the wind, and indeed that's what the shadows in the patch of light brought to mind. But when I looked up at the window, there was no tree outside, and the sounds were too close and somehow too furtive. It was almost the noise of an animal scurrying about in the dark, something trying to stay hidden. "Dave!" I hissed, and the noises stopped, and then resumed with fresh vigour. I called his name again and slapped a hand around on top of the bed, soon colliding with his body and waking him with a start. "What is it?" he mumbled blearily, and then asked again, but this time the question wasn't directed at me. "There's something in here," I whispered, and as the creaking came closer, I saw what it was. Something was materializing in the faint patch of light. I could make out a crouched figure, larger than myself but smaller than a grown man. It seemed to be thrashing as though in pain, and every movement brought the sound of creaking trees, of branches bending just before they broke. Its limbs, which may have been too many and were certainly too long, looked that way too. I could see a head, lowered though it was, and it was long and viciously curved, like a huge beak. It was so faint right at that moment that I had to blink repeatedly to clear my eyes and get a grasp on it, but it was becoming more and more solid the longer I watched, and I knew what had brought it. "The stick figure," I said, and I was no longer primarily concerned with staying quiet. "Where is it?" "My bag," he said, "the corner," and I remembered seeing it there earlier. The trouble was, I'd have to get past whatever was taking shape in order to reach it. With the unthinking bravery or stupidity of youth, I threw myself towards the corner, and the apparition raised its abominable head as I passed. I say passed, but I'm fairly certain I must have gone through the fucking thing because there was so little room. I felt a sensation like wet leaves dragging over my skin. I could smell earth and vegetation, though of a rotten and unpleasant kind. Then my hands closed around that stick figure, and I turned to throw it out the window. I couldn't. The thing was there, and it was almost solid, and it was reaching towards me with branches that were either tentacles or its arms. "Throw it to me, now!" Dave yelled, and I turned and did just that. He was standing by the bedroom door, and I managed to throw the figure easily to him before the apparition realised what I was doing. Could it realise? Was I crediting it with an intelligence beyond the most basic? Dave grabbed the stick figure and darted out of the room, and I had an awful heart-sinking moment where I thought he'd left me alone to meet whatever fate the fucking thing had in store for me, before I realised it was gone. Just like that. Apart from myself, the room was empty. I didn't have long to wonder about it. I heard Dave opening the door to his father's room, and an instant later he slammed it shut again. Some part of me must have instantly realised what he was doing, for even as he was calling out to me, I was rushing out to him. He had hold of a door handle, and he was holding the door tight shut. "Help me," he asked, and I did just that. From beyond the door, I could hear his father muttering as the noise roused him from his sleep. Then I could hear that terrible creaking sound, and then a wordless bellow of rage and fear. I'm not sure what happened next, and I will never think about it too closely. I will admit to this: we held on to that door with all our strength. We held on to it while Dave's father tried to open it from the other side, while the sound of creaking wood grew louder and somehow less brittle, more organic. We held on to it all through the screaming and all through the other sounds, wet, tearing sounds. We held on to it until the struggle stopped, until the handle went slack, and until the screaming ended. Something burst against the other side of a door, like a bag of wet rubbish flung at a wall, and that's when we ran from the house. I don't remember what happened then. Not for quite some time. We were found wandering together, silent, pale and unresponsive, in the early hours of the morning. We were taken to hospital. We were questioned by the police. We were questioned by doctors. At some point, my parents took me home. I don't know where Dave went. My last sight of him, something was gone in his eyes, some spark, some part of his spirit, his humanity. I can't believe that ever returned. I never saw him again. I know that the police went to his house and found his father's bedroom a virtual bloodbath. From what I've heard, the man was pretty much torn apart, and they never actually found all of him. They presumed that the house had been broken into and that he'd been attacked. He had a criminal record, nothing major, but enough to make them stop looking very hard. Obviously, he'd just crossed the line with the wrong people. I don't know if they ever found a stick figure in that room. I'd guess not. I'd guess it, and whatever it was a beacon for, had long gone. And now, here we are, 20-something years later. It's amazing what you can push to the back of your mind when you want to, when you need to. I grew up, lost myself in the business of studying, meeting girls, learning how to become a human being. I moved in and out of relationships and jobs and homes, and eventually settled on a good home and a good career, but still hadn't managed a good relationship. And today, I saw the story in the newspaper, and everything started to come back to me. I don't live far from the town where I grew up, but since I left, I've never been back. My parents moved away after I did, and I never had any other reason to return. And I certainly never would have revisited the woods where Dave and I used to hang out until everything turned bad. But I rather think he might have gone back there, at least once, and quite recently. David Rowley has been convicted of killing his wife and her lover shortly after he discovered their affair. The murders have been described as extraordinarily brutal. Dave says he didn't do it. I believe him.
That night the ghouls came out.